I'm Adriana de Souza Silva, and I'm a professor of communication studies at Northeastern University, where I also direct the Center for Transformative Media.
Well, I think at first when I started studying mobile communication, there was no such a thing as mobile communication. I mean, there were like few people looking at the social impacts of cell phones and social life. But I think on my case, I came from internet studies and that idea of looking at space as cyberspace, which is something a lot of people were talking about in the beginning, in the late 90s, early 2000s. So at that time, I was a PhD student, and my research was actually, because of my design background, was on how to build and design virtual worlds and social worlds online. And I always like to tell this story that I was a visiting scholar at UCLA working under Professor Victoria Vesna at the Design Media Arts Department. And once we were talking about my research, and I was saying that I was trying to design virtual worlds in cyberspace, and she said, don't you think cyberspace is kind of a word from the 90s? Because right now, when we are all carrying these devices and she holds her phone, that we actually can carry the internet with us, this idea of getting outside of our physical space to go to another space doesn't exist anymore because the internet's out in the world with us. And then I was thinking about that sentence, and that actually changed my whole trajectory, because I actually started trying to understand how this difference in interface from a fixed computer to a mobile interface, cell phone that can have internet connection, kind of changes the way we communicate with other people in physical spaces, and actually that we can actually carry the internet with us. So I think that was obviously at that time I didn't have an idea of, I'm studying mobile communication, but that was what it was, right? So actually the title of my dissertation was From Multi-User Environments in Cyberspace from Hybrid Spaces as Multi-User Environments. So that we actually bringing those social spaces and hybrid social spaces back into the physical world. Well, that's very interesting because, as I mentioned, I came from a background in design and internet studies, studying social virtual worlds online. But since I was looking at the differences in how we communicate over the internet with a cell phone, I started trying to find out any literature at that time that talked about mobile phones. And honestly, there was not a lot. There were a few references that guided my research. First was James Katz and Mark Ackl's book, Perpetual Contact, which became a classic. They organized one of the first mobile communication conference at Rutgers in 2002. And there was a collection of essays from scholars from all over the world, including Rich Ling, Leopoldina Fortunati, all talking about how people use cell phones in social situations. But one thing that kind of caught my attention in that collection is that most people were looking at cell phones as telephones, like two-way communication devices. And most of the times pointing out how cell phones would disconnect us from our surroundings, so that we are connecting with somebody that was far away, physically far away from us. Obviously, Rich Ling brought up that idea of micro-coordination, where, you can communicate and coordinate things within nearby spaces with people that you know, but was still a vision of using cell phones as a two-way communication device, and mostly for voice communication and sometimes texting. But I was actually coming from a different perspective, kind of looking at cell phones as internet-connected devices and ways of coordinating multiple people at the same time, like a multi-user environment. But that was, my problem was that was before smartphones. There were no GPS phones. And so it was very little on the mundane or ordinary world that we could find about it. So one thing that I started doing was actually doing interviews with people to kind of look at how, try to find out examples that could fit this idea. And one of the things I found at that time was this location-based game called Bot Fighters that was developed in Sweden. And it was a really weird concept because it was a game that was played with text message, but used location awareness of the phone, obviously before GPS, so was not very precise, but depending on your physical distance to other players, you could shoot with a text message and you would be successful or not depending on your distance. And when I learned about that, I was like, well, that's the perfect example of what I'm talking about, because it's a game, it's a multi-user game that's played in physical space, and the technology actually helps you connect with people who are nearby that you might not even know, except because you're playing the game. Obviously, that was not, a massive game like Pokemon Go became 10 years later, actually 16 years later, but was one of the first examples that I found. Another one was Howard Rheingold's book, Smart Mobs, because Howard Rheingold, he actually was one of the first that started talking about how cell phones could coordinate with many different people, which I call macro coordination instead of micro coordination. So he talks about flash mobs and political protests. It is in the early 2000s where like multiple people would coordinate with each other with mobile technologies. So getting from that early examples of macro coordination plus the location-based games, which also included Blast Theory's work in the UK, in games like Can You See Me Now, or games like that work across physical and digital spaces. Those were kind of my point of entry into mobile communication. So not as a phone, but looking at mobile networked communication in physical or hybrid spaces. Well, one of the things that I think it's very interesting is that there were multiple sets of scholars working on similar topics, brought from different areas. And that's one of the always like criticism I had from academia, and that people kind of it's still, we talk a lot about interdisciplinarity, but it's still very disciplinary in the sense that people work in their own silos and within publishing their own journals, but sometimes we're not even aware that people in similar disciplines or other disciplines are studying similar things, but from a different perspective. So one thing that I realized is that what are set of media artists and people that are more related to art, they were really developing new ideas and experiments with what they called locative media, which is basically using GPS technology, in the early 2000s, when the Clinton administration removed the GPS degradation signal, then people could start precisely locating things on Earth, because before it was just used for the military. So a lot of common people, including artists, started exploring what can we do when we use GPS technology. And this was before also GPS was embedded in cell phones. You could still do stuff with cell phones, but was not as precise until 2007. The iPhone 3G, I think, was the first that included that functionality. So these are primarily media artists. And then there was another set of scholars, mostly from sociology, urban studies, that were starting this other field called mobility studies, which are like Mimi Scheller, John Urry. And was about the same time that I published my Hybrid Spaces paper in 2006, that Mimi Scheller and John Urry published their the Mobilities Paradigm paper, which became a classic. And I remember the first time I saw that, I was like, oh my God, these are the people who are like talking about the importance of mobility in physical spaces and how we should pay attention to that in social sciences and not just look at static things and how that changes the way we experience space. They're actually not really taking into consideration the role of technologies. Or, I mean, they would talk a lot about cars as transportation, mobile transportation, but not the communication, the network communication piece. And then there were the mobile communication scholars who were mostly from communication and sometimes sociology, who would look at cell phones as a communication device, but ignore kind of like a little bit of the mobility aspect of it, or look more broadly in how they are embedded into mobility and spaces, or even with or location awareness, which were the artists were doing. So I remember in 2012, I organized this conference called Mobile Communication, Mobilities and Locative Media, which was exactly an attempt to try to connect all these people and see what comes up if we start exchanging perspectives. So the keynote speakers on that were Rich Link from Mobile Communication, Terry Rube, a locative media artist, and Mimi Scheller was a representative of mobilities. And was a wonderful experience because I think, you still have separations in this field. But I think today, especially after smartphones and, kind of more the embedding of these technologies in our everyday lives, we see much more connection. And I think mobile communication scholars are paying attention to the importance of mobility and definitely location awareness. Well, as I mentioned, I think I started thinking about that during my dissertation work, where I was trying to conceptualize and understand how people, because at that time, again, in internet studies, there was a lot of that talk about cyberspace as this space that's disconnected from the real world, very based on the original idea of William Gibson, that cyberspace is this kind of a world that, like immaterial world that you can download your mind and live a separate life. I mean, obviously this still exists today, especially in sci-fi, The Matrix, and we're all inspired by this sci-fi vision. But when I started looking at cell phones as ways of connecting people and connecting to the internet, we started thinking that, well, it doesn't make sense to talk about physical and digital as disconnected spaces, because we are actually embedding digital information, especially with location-based services, in physical spaces. So when you start adding longitude, latitude coordinates in everything, and you can find with a GPS, and you can embed location-based information in physical space, we're not using the internet anymore to just locate things that are far away or communicate with people that are far away. We're actually, if you look at today, and that's the argument that Eric Gordon and I do in the net locality, most of the times we use network technologies to locate and connect with things that are close to us. So location and communication, what's nearby is critical to how we interact with these communication networks. And then at that time, I remember when I was writing that paper, a lot of people, I discussed that idea with many people, and they're like, oh, but you're talking about, Lev Manovich was writing about augmented spaces, which is basically, when you start putting screens on physical space, and that you can either embed information that comes from elsewhere in physical space, if you're watching a movie, for example, or streaming, or collect information from us with CCTV cameras or things like that. And I'm saying, yeah, well, that's one important characteristic, but I'm also talking about the communication that happens. We can actually use the technology not just for information flows, but to communicate with people. So, there were also Mark Weiser's idea of ubiquitous computing that was really not that, all that time when he talked about, the early 90s, early mid 90s, about this idea of several devices spread around the environment. But he was focusing mostly on the technologies and the computation. I mean, he talked a little bit about social issues like privacy, as Paul Dorridge says, the penultimate slide problem, right? So it's almost like an afterthought. And for me, hybrid spaces was really rooted in the social and communication practices. So really, rather than just looking at a space, or for example, the idea of augmented and mixed realities were very prominent in computer science fields too, that take into consideration how you add digital information to physical spaces. But it's also focused on the technology. And obviously, hybrid spaces are created by technology, but also created by sociability. So what I wanted to call attention is that what we are looking at is not just a space as a container of things or technologies that change space, but how it's an idea constructed by the sociability of people, the technologies that we use, and the network connections. So we need to consider all these three things to understand what a hybrid space is. Well, that's actually an interesting point, because Scott Campbell and I just wrote a paper on revisiting hybrid spaces 15 years later, because we thought, well, when I first wrote that paper, there were cell phones, but there were no smartphones, and both the technological social landscapes were very different. And one of the things we realized too, because he did a very thorough lit review of how that paper has been cited, and what we realized is that, obviously it has been cited in many interesting ways, but a lot of the literature also, people use that idea of hybrid spaces as just the mix of physical and digital. So basically equating it as a mixed reality, which is one of the things that I say in the paper, that hybrid spaces are not like mixed reality. You have to take into consideration the sociability and the mobility aspects too. So I think that's one of the things we are trying to call attention, that it's not just mixing physical and digital, but it's a trifocal concept that people need to understand. But I also think a lot of scholars have taken up on this idea to understand mobile communication as embedded with mobility as well. And I think this is something, as being now one of the editors at the Mobile Communication Journal, all the three of us, me and Veronica Karnowski and Rich Ling, we really look at, when a fit with the journal and people submit papers. Still, I think the majority is, focus on cell phones, but we really want to acknowledge the mobility aspect of mobile communication. So one of the things that, and I think it's been more prominent, is that people understand that mobile communication influences how we move and how mobility influences communication. So it's not just about, let's study, dating apps on cell phones. And then we ask, what does this has to do with mobile, right? Because you could do dating apps sitting on your computer at home. So if you don't have the mobility aspect included, it's not really mobile communication. And I think that's one of the main ways that this concept has been taken up, and which kind of connects to that early idea that I mentioned, that to connect the different fields of mobility and mobile communication and locate these media. Well, I think that's the changes. This new paper that I'm just co-wrote with Scott Campbell kind of point out to that a little bit, especially in the changing in the technological landscape, because And there's a lot of mobile communication scholars are recognizing that too, that mobile communication is no longer about cell phones. Of course, it started with cell phones because that was one of the first technologies that allowed us to be mobile and communicate with other people while mobile and connect to the internet. But today, there are many other technologies that do that. You know, you have the watches, you have the iPads or tablets, and not only this, like sensors spread around the environment and other embedded infrastructures, and all the, I think a lot of the scholarship also has focused on the infrastructures that support these network technologies that sometimes people just ignore and not talk about them. So I think it's kind of, first of all, recognizing that mobile communication, and we talk about mobile media, right, too, which are the devices that enable mobile communications, not just about cell phones. We need to look at the network connection among all these technologies, and that kind of broadens up the spaces where we study mobile communication, not just, you know, like sometimes home spaces, but also urban spaces, and that connects with literature on smart cities, for example, which is that whole idea of the cities that are embedded with network connections. And I think there's a lot of interesting research also looking at the global south and other less connected places, not just in the global south, but in the global north too, you know, like that, recognizing that these mobile communication spaces or hybrid spaces are very uneven spaces. So that, you know, in the beginning, a lot of people would, you know, understandable, focused on Europe, and a lot of the research started in Scandinavia and Japan because these were the countries that first developed cellular networks. And now, of course, we have cellular network connections all over the world, but the level of connection that these spaces have is different, right? So I think it's important to recognize these differences and understand how people use mobile communication and how that's embedded in their lives, not just in terms of development, because early literature also on mobile, there was a lot of, you know, mobiles for development or ICT for the information and communication technologies for development, looking at how it's a kind of a most technocratic view of looking into how these technologies can bump up economies and take people out of poverty. But I think we also need to kind of look at from other perspectives, you know, really how this is embedded in people's lives and changing the way people communicate. And for example, I mean, a lot of my research of my empirical research is in Brazil, and as in a lot of other developing countries, a lot of people use WhatsApp as a way of communicating, and that's highly mobile in the sense that a lot of actually mobile workers, they use that because the cell phone is their primary, you know, work tool, and people actually pay things via WhatsApp, do telehealth, like everything. It's a much more actually relevant technology for people who live in places where they don't have access to 2 computers and 3 tablets like sometimes we have here. So kind of looking at other spaces and including scholars from other countries and cultural spaces as well, I think it's important. Well, I think there are lots of, it's always hard to predict the future, right? Recently, again, Scott Campbell and Gerard Gauguin, Leopoldina Fortunati and me, we edited the special issue of New Media and Society about the futures of mobile communication. And then we realized that obviously people think of futures in many different ways. And as I always like to say, most of the ways we envision the future never happens. But I think, I mean, one thing that I just mentioned is to kind of pay attention to the changing technological landscape, and especially some new technologies that, you know, they're always happening, and and coming up, new things are going to arise. But right now, a lot of people talk about artificial intelligence, for example. And I think we need to pay attention into how these AI technologies are also going to influence mobile communication, not only the way that we talk to each other or we talk with the AI, like in ChatGPT and things like that, but how they going to change how we move around our physical spaces. So, for example, when you have driverless cars or intelligent transport systems that kind of direct transit and help you to get a cab or tell you what's the best route. So these AI technologies are going to be changing not only communication, but mobility as well. And again, I think my main issue and area of focus is always like how to connect the communication with the mobility, because I think sometimes we focus on one aspect and forget how it's all networked and connected. But I hope that, I'm really happy as vice chair of the mobile communication division at ICA that our group of scholars is growing and we have a lot of interest. We are actually the most diverse division at ICA with the most number of countries, of people from different countries, and young scholars as well. So I hope we keep growing and really connecting and people from, again, countries outside the global north. And really, as also one of the editors of Mobile Media and Communication, I want to see people who are non-English speakers. I know there's always like a big language barrier, but I think we need to make an effort to include people whose primary languages are not English into this discussion, because a lot of times the scholarly conversations get really skewed to, the hashtag first world problems and or a foreign view of other countries and other cultures. And I think we need to include that. So I think it's more than looking at the technologies, is trying to kind of open up the perspective and be more inclusive as well.